hello and welcome to The Fact. During the past few days, we had a very saddening news in which so many Muslims were brutally murdered when saying prayers in a mosque in New Zealand in a terrorist attack. 49 people, 49 men, women, and innocent children were killed, and too many others were injured in cold blood. And our condolences goes to our fellow New Zealanders. We have gathered here tonight to speak about this tragedy and to speak about Islamophobia in whole world. Ali, could you please introduce our dear guests?
Yes, sure. I would like to welcome all of you again. We have today Professor Alexander Azadgan. He is a senior political analyst and a professor of strategic global management and international political economy. Also, we have Catherine Shackdam, political analyst and commentator. And also we have Mr. Paul Larudee, political activist and founder of Free Gaza Movement. We would like to welcome all of you, and it is a great honor to have all three of you respected guests with us in this program. And also me, your host, and Fatima Bidar will be at your service in this meeting of The Fact. Well, I would like to actually start with the first question, starting with Ms. Shackdam. How much do you think Western mainstream medias are contributing to Islamophobia, and what is the reason behind that?
Well, I'm going to say they're not 100% responsible. I don't think it would be fair to say this. However, I'm going to say that they definitely played heavily into the narrative by basically taking the cues from state officials. And I think that across the Western world, without exception, to be quite frank with you. And you just have to see it the way, for example, how British media actually covered the New Zealand massacre, refusing to call it what it is, which is an act of terrorism. And this is something that has shocked not just the British public, but many people across the world, to see how news outlets such as the Daily Mail and others have been so willing to almost excuse and rationalize the acts of terror that this one man, this fascist, racist, white supremacist criminal committed in New Zealand, trying somehow to portray him as an innocent victim. And we all know that if it had been the other way around, if it had been a case where we had, for example, a Muslim, a terrorist, a jihadist, a Wahhabi, Salafi, whatever you want to call him, to even commit half of the horror that this man committed, then everyone everywhere across the world would have condemned it heavily, would have talked about it non-stop, would have covered the issue on all angles possible. That wasn't the case in New Zealand. People, I've read many comments on news stories or commentaries, or, so many people came out and actually excusing the man and trying to say that somehow the victims were actually had it coming because they were Muslim and therefore they were not needed. So in many ways, the media have helped portray Muslim as foreigners, as the other, as criminals. They have helped systematically othering Muslim by making them out to be somehow outside of society. And there's a very dangerous rhetoric right now in the West, whereas Muslims are considered to be foreigners. And so Islam has become a nationality. And this is very dangerous because you're playing right into the hand of white supremacists and other extremist fascists by linking a faith and somehow making out to be a flag, and therefore you're making it as if it's possible to actually wage war against a particular demographic by linking it to a particular foreign policy. And that, for me, is absolutely key, and how media and British media in particular are definitely to blame for that. And of course, there is also the fact that they refuse to give proper airtime to the systematic targeting and victimization of Muslims across the world. By not talking about it, they are actually excusing the criminals committing those acts of violence against Muslims. And this is happening every day. It's never talked about because it disturbs people. don't want to believe that they deviate society when in fact they are not.
Okay, perfect. And Mr. Larudee, what's your take about this question?
In prehistory, that human societies vilify their enemies, and when they want to create war, then they will make the enemy into the devil. This is what the West is doing with Islam. It's what Israel is doing with the Palestinians. It's what the United States is doing with Syria and Venezuela and so forth. They're turning their enemies into devils, and the media is at their disposal for this purpose. This is exactly what they're doing. Now, they're not always very obvious about it. Sometimes they try to say, well, Muslims have the right to worship and so forth. But and it's not limited just to Muslims. It's also Hindus and others, other groups, religions and nationalities and ethnicities and races and so on and so forth. This is a standard procedure that every government, every leadership that has ever been in existence will make the enemy into the devil. And this is what the Western media is doing. I don't know what else to say about this. We have to fight it, of course.
Perfect.
But I think that as a practical measure, we also have to expect it.
Perfect. Right. So, just concerning this first question, Professor, I would like to know if this reason that mainstream media tries to actually purify it or actually just treat somehow in a soft way with such criminals or with such terrorists, and it never calls them terrorists, only tries to call them some kind of sick guy who actually played lots of video games and were affected by such material or by such, side effects of their life. But when it comes to Muslims, they just directly call them terrorists.
I think there are several things going on here. I think the war that the West has declared against Islam is not, especially the media war. It's a psychological operation. Sam Harris, a godless atheist, not too long ago just gave it away when he said, "It's time we admitted that we are not at war with terrorism. We are at war with Islam." This is Sam Harris. I'm sure your audience knows of him, and if they don't, they may Google him. He's carrying a lot of weight next to Bill Maher and people like this, propagandists in our mainstream media. He gets a lot of time on CNN and Fox News and MSNBC and the rest of them. So they're trying to they're trying to manufacture consent to attack various Muslim countries, and they have set the precedent for that with Iraq in 2003 and Libya in 2011, and their failed attempt to do the same thing in Syria, which is coming to an end. It's interesting, BBC never called ISIS. They never called them Daesh, they never called them ISIL. They go out of their way during all these years to call them Islamic State. They intentionally wanted to say Islamic and associate those images on their screen to Islam. Does that mean these savages are not Muslim? Well, according to Quran, you cannot call somebody a not Muslim. That's takfirism, which is what ISIS has been doing all along. So you can just call them people of a different sect or people that are deviated or terrorists or savages or whatever. And this is what I think the Iranian media and other non-mainstream alternative media has called them. I think they are very much interested, and they have been at this for a long time, to attach the word Islam or to attach the word terrorist with Muslims. It's a neuro-linguistic programming. It's a form of brainwashing. So the minute you mention terrorism, people would immediately identify that with Islam. And, let's not kid around. We all know who really is controlling the mainstream media in the West. And they have a vested interest, especially when they have a thug and a murderer like Netanyahu in power, and I can go into depth with that a little bit later. How could we forget the savagery that this Norwegian, a few years ago, back on July 27, 2011 to be exact, inflicted in Norway, in downtown Norway, the governmental seat of Norway, and then in that island, well, the children of the left liberal elite were at. Anders Breivik was his name. And they tried to attach him to, you know, Freemason groups, Illuminati, Knight Templar groups. They tried to come up with all these other explanations than just calling me a downright terrorist. Now, of course, later on, they do call him a lifetime, you know, some kind of a terrorist. I mean, CNN is done that. On July 16th, they published an article, July 16th, 2018, and they did call him a terrorist. The article was, the title of the article was Norway Terror Attacks, Fast Facts. So they went into facts of this lunatic, who, by the way, was not just a regular lunatic. That in and out of itself justifies the fact that he's just somebody who's only mentally ill. It's beyond being mentally ill. These people are, I don't want to use the term Islamophobia because it's turned into a cliche, but they have deep hatred and a lot of hostility toward Islam. They believe Muslims are taking over in Europe. They continually say that the name Muhammad is the name that most parents call their children in France and in UK, and they try to create this spirit of fear, and they try to attach that to all Muslims, try to paint them all with the same brush. We all know that the Muslims who have migrated from countries that are very extreme Salafist or Wahhabi are the ones that don't assimilate. There are plenty of Muslims in Europe that still wear the Islamic cover, the hijab, who have assimilated, who speak the language, who are not troublemakers, who are not terrorists, and we rarely see their side. We rarely see coverage by CNN and other fake news of Islamic scholars who are ready to go on air and condemn these acts. Instead, they bring in other extremist elements, especially those that are very sympathetic to the Zionist cause, and then they try to, paint them out, like I said, with the same brush. Let's not kid around. In my opinion, rich Zionist people are telling...
Okay, Catherine, can you actually explain about this point? Because you and also Mr. Larudee and also Mr. Azadgan, all of you explained many different things and also gave examples of contributions that mainstream media gives to this kind of hatred toward Islam. I want to know if this whole thing shows any kind of direct support or endorsement from Western mainstream.
It's not so much that they support terrorism per se. I think it's more to do with the way that editors and the corporation owning those newspapers, the direction that they want to take. If you take the Washington Post, for example, it used to be owned by the Saudi quite a lot, and it was bought by Qatar, and you can see the change in narrative, how it operated. There was a shift against Saudi Arabia in favor of other country in a different kind of narrative. So today, journalism is not anymore in the business of actually telling the truth or informing people, but has to do with it has become a tool of propaganda. And in that way, you could say that yes, to a great extent, it's excusing terrorism when this terrorism is directed at Muslims and is trying to kind of fan out sectarianism when Muslims are actually doing the terrorism. And by Muslim, I actually mean Wahhabi and Salafi and the kind of terror militants that are being paid and trained and funded by Saudi Arabia. We all know this. Newspapers know this, journalists know this, editors know this, but the thing is, they're part of the machine and they cannot fight. They want to be paid, they want to make a living, and so if they want to continue to be published or even appear on television, this is what they have to do, and those are the things that they have to say. And then, of course, there's a greater political agenda that a lot of lobby are actually putting a lot of money into media, and I'm talking about the Zionist lobby and the Saudi lobby, trying to push a certain narrative. And of course, it actually, it makes sense for Salafi, Wahhabi, and Zionists to ensure that the greater public learns to hate everything that has to do with Islam, because in turn, the likes of Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, Daesh, Al-Nusra, and the rest of them can actually turn around and say, see, they hate Muslims, they want to kill Muslims, they are discriminating against Muslims across the world. Therefore, we need to become more radicalized and we need to wage war against them. So this cycle of violence is being fed by mainstream media, and it's very sad to see that there are so very few intellectuals or even journalists that have the courage to actually sit outside the fray and call it what it is that our democracies have been hijacked, are basically under attack and are literally dying because the rules of engagement that we had, in that the media is there to actually check and hold our officials accountable, and the policy that they're running is broken, it's not working anymore because it has been bought out by the politics, by the establishment. So this is why you see that now the media has just become an extension of governments and regimes across the world. And in the West, that translates into Islamophobia. It translates into fascism. It translates into excusing, for example, the death of Palestinian children by the hands of Israel, while excusing the murder of children in Yemen, for example. It has become very clear, but the public who are receiving those news are none the wiser, because I think they are quite ignorant about what is happening in the world, because they don't feel that they are concerned. There's a lot of kind of white entitlement in that they think that, if they identify as white Christian, then they're not concerned by what is happening. Very few people understand that it's not about religion, it's not about Islam per se. It has to do with the fact that Islam happens to be the majority religion in this region of the world that Western capitals would love to control. And that is, of course, the Islamic world, the Middle East and Asia and Africa. So this is not, I don't think it's a religious crusade per se.
Okay, just in this point, because you mentioned, Muslims, and in here I would like to actually to know the real issues and the struggles that you have seen Muslims are facing in Europe, because you're in England, and after all I would ask Mr. Larudee about USA, but in your take, what are the issues that Muslims are facing right now?
I have seen it in schools. I think that all in all, Britain is not the worst place to be, although it's becoming quite hard. But places like France or Germany or even Spain have become intolerable if you're Muslim, in particular if you're a Muslim woman, because it's. In Britain, for example, if you wear the headscarf, you are systematically face up, and if you happen to be in the public eye, you will have threat of acid attack, of being knifed, or your children being kidnapped, or people exploding your house or knifing your children. Those are the things, for example, that I have faced. This is happening across Britain, and the problem is there is nothing that the police can do. They are not equipped to deal with this kind of threat. There's a lot of bullying in places of work, where Muslim women or men who identify as Muslim men have been basically cut out from any chances of promotion. They are being discriminated against systematically. They are, looked upon as if they're the enemy. They are looked upon as if, they are basically walking bombs that they could explode at any given moment. People have been singled out at airports. Police are randomly checking people, but randomly it's basically ethnic profiling. If someone looks like they are potentially Muslim, then they will be arrested or stopped or questioned. And it's very humiliating, this systematic doubting of your character, or this systematic aggression and violence towards you just because you happen to be Muslim. And I think that it's even more difficult if you identify as a Shia Muslim, because in this case, you are literally being hated by everybody, including Wahhabi and Salafi, who would like to take off your head. So it's a difficult thing to be in the UK, and the way that people have managed so far is to kind of withdraw behind their own community lines, and that means living closer together. But then you become a sitting target as well, because then everybody can identify this neighborhood as that neighborhood as being, Muslim or Shia Muslim or Wahhabi Muslim.
Yeah, you mentioned great points actually regarding this subject. Actually, Mr. Larudee, maybe you know that some of the victims of this terrorist attack were those people who were believing that for example, in that country there wouldn't be any kind of racism toward Muslims, and they will be having a good life actually. But suddenly they became the victim of such an attack, and that's just something surprising for many people who actually right now they're thinking that such countries are safe for Muslims.
Muslims in the U.S. Are, in fact, I think, under almost more danger than in, let's say, Norway or New Zealand or other places. But the point is that the media act in a subtle way, and it's a way that's implicit in the media. It's rather like dealing with the number of women or the number of blacks that are seen in positions of power and importance in the media. It's also true, and true even more so, for Muslims. You don't see women in headscarves in very much. It's not totally largely and there's lots of background noise. Is that a problem? Anyway, okay. So what happens is that the mainstream media generally treat the death of Muslims as less important than other deaths. One very clear example is in the case of Israel. Israelis, Jewish Israelis that is, who are killed in the conflict, you can call it there, are 50 times more likely to be reported than the deaths of Palestinians, not all of whom are Muslim, but they're Palestinians. So that's an example of how the media treat the people who are not like the most Americans, who are, let's say, the majority are white and Anglo. So this bias is inherent in the media, and the media will not, even if they express sympathy and talk about Muslim rights and all of these sorts of things, they will not normalize. They will not generate stories which give sympathy to Muslims. They won't project Muslims in a sympathetic light as people who are just like the rest of us and have normal problems of child upbringing and job and so forth. I mean, you don't see them on situation comedies and this sort of thing. So in that way, they're treated as other, as ones that are not to be trusted. It's part of the bias of the American media.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Mr. Larudee. I would like actually to ask my next question from Mr. Azadgan, in case you can hear me. I don't have your video, your picture in here. If you can activate your camera, perfect. I would like to know, we have talked about lots of things that has been going on concerning Muslim community and also the terrorist threats toward Muslims, but what is the
I think there's no way to prevent such attacks when you have special interests that are benefiting from these attacks. Your other guest mentioned mainstream media. I think worse than mainstream media is what these people do underground in their weird websites and chat groups and even what they post on their Facebook wall or Instagram wall or Twitter wall, which for most part so it supposedly goes unnoticed. I think we gotta really go into that. The mainstream media does what mainstream media does. What we can do, as an educator, what I do with my students who are young and energetic and disgruntled is to advise them not to get their news from mainstream media, especially when it comes to Middle Eastern affairs, because it's nothing but propaganda and contrived, stories that are, even every word is put together or directed or manipulated by the senior editors behind the camera. So first you have to diagnose the problem correctly, and that's 50% of the solution. I don't indoctrinate my students. I don't tell them where to get their news from. I just tell them don't go near mainstream media if you're interested in the Middle East or the religions of the Middle East. But, being a Muslim, especially Muslim women, or, in the case of Salafi or Wahhabi Muslim men who grow big beards, that's going to, stand out. The hijab that our Muslim sisters wear is going to make you stand out. And these people are inherently racist, in my opinion. Europe has been a continent where people usually migrated out of. The phenomenon that we've been seeing with people, millions of people migrating into Europe, has been only an 80-year phenomenon, starting with the Turkish people who came to Holland and Germany, mostly Germany, to build a continent that was destroyed as a result of European wars amongst themselves. And that was 80 years ago. And then, these folks have, in their third generation of immigrants, and they still feel alienated by the bigger society. Add 9/11 to this equation, and then everything goes to hell in a handbasket. So I think what we need to see more of and there are plenty of Muslim, cultural centers and mosques or what have you in UK who need to be a whole lot more vocal about, presenting their disgust and giving the feedback about these Caucasian terrorist attacks. And they need to go on our own news media, because the mainstream is not going to exhibit their points of view. Your guest mentioned Fox News. Fox News, 7% of Fox News is owned by this company called Kingdom Holding Company, which is headed by Prince bin Talal in Saudi Arabia. And rarely do you get anything negative about Saudi Arabia. And in my opinion, that's the head of the snake. It's the most terrorist sponsoring nation on earth, definitely in the Middle East. And because of these proxy wars, there hasn't been any clear defeat for them. Their proxies have been defeated in Syria, but you look at them, they're still at it when it goes to Yemen. So we need to, these people that need to sort of go on media need to really point the finger at Saudi Arabia, and not their cousins, but their brothers over there in Israel. Let me go ahead and my colleagues in the intelligentsia have been leaking things to me, and they're telling me this is very suspicious that this event happened at the same time the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu launched a 100-target attack against Hamas. We think in the New Zealand attack, or my contacts in the intelligentsia, they believe this was a fake distraction psyops by what they call Five Eyes, or the Five Column, as a cover for Israeli-Saudi war against Iran. Hopefully that would never happen, but we need to keep an eye on this. I've been monitoring Fox News, and a few nights ago in Sean Hannity's program, it kind of slipped from Sean Hannity when he said, quote, "It is essential for Bibi to stay in power." So what we have here is Netanyahu launching a war against Hamas and possibly Iran, God forbid, by triggering a 6-month conflict to distract people and prosecutors and lose evidence in order to keep Netanyahu from being deposed, impeached, and prosecuted for financial crimes in the Israeli courts. This is a false flag Israeli distraction, my colleagues believe. So the New Zealand events seem to, and there's been so many other events in France in particular comes to mind, that at such a sensitive time, these things kind of happen. Personally, I don't think they may necessarily be false flag operations. There is this thing called the Sanaim, or the Zionist army in the media, and especially in academia. We come across them a lot. They're the fifth column. They're quiet. They turn you in if you say anything negative about Israel. And they exert a lot of power. The Sanaim exert a lot of power in the media. So at the very crucial time when things are shifting in the Middle East, suddenly you have these events happening, and we don't believe these are accidental. Going back to New Zealand, there's something else I want to quote here. There are some very suspicious elements of the event in New Zealand, and as the images that we've been seeing confirm this situation. First, the timestamp on the tweet from the police department says the March 14th attack at 5:55 p.m., but then the police briefing is dated March 15th at 6:10 p.m. This is what we do as investigating journalists and academics. We look at the details and point out the lies. So this was a day early or a day late. Then two victims entered into the missing persons database, having their information entered, or they entered the database, having their info entered into the system, and precisely the same time, which is 10:36. What does that mean? I think it's impossible for these two events the time to coincide. Also, it's very strange that the New Zealand Police Commissioner, not the Prime Minister, yeah. I don't speak generally. I go into detail.
Okay, Professor. I just need to know something. I just need to know something because you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, don't worry. Actually, all of these points you said are perfectly interesting for me because they shows how everything just.
Based on all you said, which is very true, don't you think that a part of the problem is the Muslims themselves, and it's their fault? It's related to them because they have never tried to use their chances to confront the mainstream media and the negative propaganda against the Muslims.
It is. You are correct in that, in your assertion. But on the same token, they are not given the opportunity to appear. The Bill Maher show here in Southern California, a few times they allowed Reza Aslan, a scholar, a colleague of mine, a scholar of all religions and especially Islam. Several times he was invited, but when he really spoke truth to power, same with Ben Affleck, they weren't invited again. So you have people from outside the Muslim community defending the Muslim community, and when they do a good job, and then afterwards there's a lot of coverage on social media, they're not invited again. So on one hand, yes, the Muslims in Europe stand out. It's the same thing that happened with the Orthodox Jewish community in the 1930s in Europe, and they're being scapegoated. On the other hand, if you're really articulate, like Catherine, like other folks who go on RT and other mainstream media, non-mainstream media, they're given a platform there, but never given a platform on CNN. Or if they if they bring somebody on CNN, it's usually a crazy radical Muslim who actually affirms what the host is trying to propagate. So this is what's happening in the editorial rooms in mainstream media. Go ahead.
Yes, Catherine, please.
Can I answer? Can I answer? I wanted to answer. I wanted to jump into that question. I agree with Alexander a lot, but here's what I'm going to say is that I think that Muslims so far, the first criticism that I would lay would be that Muslims have stand very, very disunited. And I think that the problem stemming from the fact that there is no real voice for the community, where people are too busy trying to run, what I call community politics, rather than trying to do what's best for the community as a whole. So I think there's been a lack in leadership. And I think that as far as media or social media are concerned, I think that we have dropped the ball in that rather than, if we cannot access to, CNN, Washington Post or whatever, if we're not invited, which we should expect because we are the designated enemy, so why should they invite us? We have other avenues that we could explore, but we have failed to actually use them. Social media are actually quite powerful. And if I could take an example, because a lot of the time people say, oh, it's impossible, the machine is so big, how can we just, one person or just a few people make a difference? I would like to remind people that, Iran revolution started off with one man, Imam Khomeini, issuing cassettes. from his place in Paris. And everyone said that it would be absolutely impossible for anyone to master the millions of people in Iran and actually create a movement that would be capable of deposing a Shah. And deposing a monarchy is much harder than actually breaking, through the barricades of fascism. So it is possible, but we have failed because we have been lazy, we have been very complacent, and I think that we are quite happy playing the victims a lot of the time, and I have to say that it's on us. When you look at, for example, Yemen, or if you look at Bahrain, and the way that people have been steadfast in their resistance, we could if we wanted to. The people are not willing to pay the price for forcing others to listen to them. And I think that we have been too easily swayed, and we're too comfortable pointing the finger at other people, saying it's their fault, it's their responsibility, when it's actually ours. We have to be braver. We have to be more courageous in telling the truth, and we have to understand that the battle lines have already been drawn. We just need to decide where it is that we stand. And I have to say that a lot of the time people say that they want to resist against oppression, but they're not, because what they're doing is actually targeting people from their own community, because all they want to do really is to hug the TV, hug the airtime, and become famous. And I have to say that I think it has been the greatest sin of our community as a whole, is that we're not trying to speak the truth for everyone. We're trying to become famous, or to become noticed, or to make a name for ourselves, when really all we should be willing to do is actually help each other and make people understand that the enemy is not Islam, the enemy is not the other. Being a foreigner or an immigrant is not a negative adjective. What we have to do is actually live by the moral and ethos that Islam is teaching us, or other religions for that matter, and actually enact it rather than just, screaming up from the top of our lungs. And we not have been systematic in decrying Wahhabism and Zionism, because again, we are too preoccupied with our own careers. And I think that it's on us, all of us, not just as media people, but it doesn't matter what you do in life. You have to choose, again, what is it that you stand for.
Thank you, Catherine.
And a lot of the time people say one thing and they do another. So I think it's on us a lot of it.
Give a summarize what you said, and let's finish the conference. Mr. Larudee,
I have a question,
sure?
And that is, why should Muslims be united? It's the diversity of Muslims, and lots of Muslims speak with their own voice and they reflect.
Frozen. I don't even see my own image.
I think it's impossible to be united, and so.
Yeah.
Yes, I heard. No, what I was saying, what I mean about united, I was talking about united against, this racism, sectarianism, and the hatred that people are facing. I'm not making an argument for Muslims to suddenly become kind of uniform. The pluralism in Islam is what makes Islam so interesting. But we all facing the same hatred. Yeah, it's just united against hatred and reject it on the basis that it is hateful, and so therefore fascism is not a good idea for society in any way, shape, or form. But and I think that Muslims have failed to recognize that it's a universal
where we can work together. In the West, we have to face it with different means and in different situations. Let's remember that in the West, the Muslims are projected according to the Muslims that the West supports. What Muslims receive the greatest funding from the West? For example, the so-called Muslims of Daesh and basically terrorists. These are the ones that have gotten the most direct funding from Western governments, and this is the image that the West wants to project of them, regardless of what they say. So this is part of the plan to create the appearance of Muslims as terrorists, of Muslims as the devils, and so forth. This is the name of Islam itself is derived from peace, and this is not projected in the West. It is the exact opposite. So these voices, I'm not sure. I don't have a strategy for getting those that image, the positive image of Islam into the West, especially when the West has a desire to project Islam as something that needs to be fought against, as a means of projecting Western power, a means of subjugating societies in the rest of the world. Who are they going to subjugate? The ones that are least Western in a way. So this is part of what they're trying to achieve. But this, all I can say is this is what we face.
Thank you. There is a lot to say, but this is the end of the conference. Ali, would you please?
Yes, sure. Again, I would like to thank all three of you respected guests. It was truly a great honor to have you in this program, and also Dr. Azadgan, that I don't have his image right now, but it is truly our best of honor to have all of you in here, and I hope we can have you again in next episode.